High above the Pacific Ocean, where the sun turned the water into sheets of gold and the clouds drifted like white mountains in the sky, Japanese fighter pilots soared with absolute confidence in their machines and their destiny. They had ruled these skies since the war began, their Zeros dancing through the air like deadly dragonflies, fast and agile and seemingly untouchable. American planes were heavy, they said. American pilots were slow and clumsy, weighed down by thick armor plating and defensive guns that made their aircraft lumber through the sky like flying fortresses. The Japanese pilots laughed at this American obsession with protection, mocking the thick steel plates bolted to enemy cockpits and the heavy-caliber machine guns mounted on wings and fuselages. Why carry all that weight when speed and maneuverability could win any dogfight? Why hide behind armor when skill and spirit could defeat any enemy? But on one fateful day in the middle of the vast Pacific, when formations of American fighters rose to meet the Japanese interceptors, something happened that would shatter this confidence forever. The distinctive sound of 50-caliber machine guns erupted across the sky like thunder, and Japanese pilots watched in horror as those mocked bullets, each 1/2 inch in diameter and weighing nearly 2 ounces, tore through their lightweight aircraft like a buzzsaw through paper. Wings exploded into fragments, fuel tanks erupted in flames, and the graceful Zeros that had dominated the Pacific skies began falling from the heavens like broken birds. In that moment, mockery turned to terror, and the entire philosophy of Japanese fighter design faced a brutal reckoning that would cost thousands of lives before the war finally ended. The story begins years before the Pacific War erupted, in the quiet design offices and manufacturing plants of Japan, where brilliant engineers worked tirelessly to create the perfect fighter aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was born from a simple but dangerous philosophy that would define Japanese aviation throughout the coming war. Japanese military planners believed that in aerial combat, speed and maneuverability mattered more than anything else. A pilot who could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver his opponent would always win the fight, they reasoned. Every extra pound of weight reduced these critical capabilities, so Japanese designers stripped away everything they considered unnecessary. Armor plating that might protect the pilot was removed because it added weight. Self-sealing fuel tanks that could prevent fires when punctured were rejected because they were heavier than standard tanks. The Zero emerged as a masterpiece of lightweight construction, an aircraft so agile it could turn inside any opponent, climb faster than almost any contemporary fighter, and fly farther than anyone thought possible. When it first appeared in combat over China in 1940, the Zero shocked everyone who encountered it. Chinese pilots flying Soviet-built fighters found themselves completely outclassed. The Zero could outmaneuver them, outclimb them, and stay in the air longer than any fighter they had ever seen. Japanese pilots racked up victory after victory, their confidence growing with each successful mission. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the Zero had achieved legendary status. Japanese pilots believed they flew the finest fighter aircraft in the world, and early results in the Pacific seemed to prove them absolutely right. When the Pacific War exploded into existence with the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, American pilots suddenly found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything they had prepared for in training. The early months of the war became a nightmare for American airmen scattered across the Pacific theater. At Wake Island in the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, and across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, American pilots climbed into their fighters and bombers only to discover that Japanese aircraft, especially the mysterious Zero, possessed capabilities that seemed almost impossible. American pilots flying the Brewster Buffalo and the early models of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk found themselves in desperate fights for survival. The Buffalo, which had seemed adequate in peacetime exercises, proved tragically inferior to the Zero in almost every measurable way. Zeros could turn inside the American fighters with ease, climb above them rapidly, and chase them down in level flight. American pilots who survived their first encounters with Zeros returned to their bases shaken and confused. They reported that Japanese fighters seemed to float through the sky, turning impossibly tight circles and appearing suddenly on their tails no matter what maneuvers they attempted. The kill ratios in these early engagements were horrifying. Japanese pilots were shooting down American aircraft at rates of 5-1, sometimes even 10-1. Entire squadrons were decimated in single engagements. At airfields across the Pacific, maintenance crews worked desperately to repair damaged aircraft, while pilots gathered in briefing rooms trying to understand how to fight an enemy that seemed superior in every way. The psychological impact was devastating. American pilots had been trained to believe in their equipment and their skills, but now they faced an enemy whose aircraft seemed to defy the laws of physics and whose pilots flew with suicidal determination. But even as Japanese pilots celebrated their victories and mocked the heavy American aircraft that seemed so easy to shoot down, a fatal weakness lurked at the heart of the Zero's design. The same philosophy that made the Zero so agile and gave it such incredible range also made it extraordinarily fragile. Without armor plating protecting the pilot and critical systems, every bullet that struck a Zero had the potential to cause catastrophic damage. The fuel tanks, lacking self-sealing capability, would pour gasoline into the airstream at the slightest puncture, and a single tracer round could turn that fuel stream into a river of fire that would engulf the entire aircraft in seconds. Japanese pilots understood this vulnerability better than anyone, but the culture of the Imperial Japanese military encouraged them to dismiss such concerns. Dying in combat was considered honorable, even glorious, and a true warrior should not concern himself with survival but only with victory. This mindset, combined with the incredible early success of the Zero in combat, led Japanese pilots to believe that their superior skill and fighting spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. They looked at American aircraft with their thick armor plates bolted around cockpits and their heavy defensive armament and saw only weakness. Why would a pilot need armor unless he expected to be hit? Why carry heavy defensive guns unless you lack the skill to avoid enemy fire in the first place? Japanese pilots convinced themselves that American emphasis on protection revealed a fundamental lack of warrior spirit. They joked in their ready rooms about American pilots hiding behind steel plates, flying in aircraft so heavy with defensive measures that they could barely maneuver. This mockery spread through Japanese fighter units, reinforced by the easy victories of the early war period. But this arrogance would exact a terrible price once American tactics and technology began to evolve. Deep in American research facilities and military planning offices, engineers and tacticians worked desperately to find solutions to the Zero problem. They studied every piece of intelligence they could gather, examined wreckage from shot-down Zeros, and debriefed every pilot who survived an encounter with the Japanese fighters. Gradually, a picture emerged of both the Zero's incredible strengths and its critical weaknesses. American planners realized they could not beat the Zero at its own game. American aircraft would never be as light or as maneuverable as the Japanese fighters, at least not with the level of protection American doctrine demanded for its pilots. But perhaps they did not need to match the Zero's agility. Perhaps there was another way to win. The answer lay in American aircraft's existing advantages, and in particular in the devastating power of the Browning M250 caliber machine gun. This weapon, developed in the years after World War I, fired bullets that were substantially larger and more powerful than the rifle-caliber weapons common on most fighter aircraft. Each .50 caliber round measured half an inch in diameter and weighed nearly 2 ounces. When these rounds struck a target, they delivered enormous destructive energy. American fighters had been equipped with these weapons from the beginning, but early tactics had not taken full advantage of their capabilities. Now American pilots began to learn new methods of fighting, tactics that would play to their strengths while exploiting Japanese weaknesses. Instead of trying to turn with Zeros in traditional dogfights, American pilots were taught to use speed and altitude to their advantage. They would dive from above, make a single high-speed firing pass, and then use their superior diving speed to escape before the Zero could bring its maneuverability to bear. The key was to get in close, hit hard with those devastating .50 caliber guns, and then get out before the enemy could respond. The tactical revolution that transformed American aerial combat in the Pacific had a simple name that belied its deadly effectiveness. Pilots called it boom and zoom, and it represented a complete reimagining of how to fight the Zero. American squadron commanders drilled this new doctrine into their pilots with relentless intensity. Never try to turn with a Zero, they emphasized again and again. Never get into a slow-speed maneuvering fight where the Japanese fighters' superior agility would dominate. Instead, American pilots learned to climb to high altitude before engages, giving themselves an energy advantage that could be converted to speed. When they spotted Japanese formations below them, they would roll into steep dives, building up tremendous velocity as gravity accelerated their heavily built fighters toward terminal velocity. At these speeds, the sturdy American aircraft held together while lighter Japanese designs sometimes suffered structural failures. American pilots would plunge through Japanese formations with their .50 caliber guns blazing, holding down the triggers for just a few seconds as they flashed past their targets at closing speeds that could exceed 600 miles per hour. Then, instead of trying to maneuver for another shot, they would use their speed to extend away from the fight, climbing back to altitude where they could set up another attack. Japanese pilots found themselves frustrated and confused by these tactics. The traditional dogfight that favored Zero's maneuverability never materialized. Instead, American fighters would appear suddenly from above, guns roaring, and then vanish again before the Zeros could respond. Japanese pilots would attempt to pursue, hauling their fighters around in tight turns to chase the Americans, only to watch helplessly as the heavier American aircraft simply outran them in straight-line speed. The psychological impact of the .50 caliber machine gun on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. The sound of these weapons firing was distinctive and terrifying, a deep hammering roar that could be heard even over the noise of aircraft engines and wind. Each gun fired at approximately 400 rounds per minute, and American fighters typically carried multiple .50 caliber weapons. A Grumman F6F Hellcat mounted 6 of these guns in its wings, giving it incredible firepower that could be brought to bear in a single concentrated burst. When a Hellcat pilot pressed his firing button, all 6 guns would erupt simultaneously, sending a combined 2,400 rounds per minute downrange in a converging cone of destruction. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with these weapons reported that being hit by .50 caliber fire felt like their aircraft had flown into a wall. The heavy bullets struck with such force that they could shatter wing spars, punch through engine blocks, and blow apart control surfaces in explosions of torn metal and fabric. A Zero that might shrug off hits from smaller caliber weapons would come apart under .50 caliber fire like it was made of tissue paper. Fuel tanks that had no self-sealing capability would rupture and spray gasoline throughout the airframe, and the incendiary rounds mixed into American ammunition belts would ignite that fuel instantly. Japanese pilots learned to fear the sight of tracers streaking toward them from an American fighter, knowing that those glowing bullets represented only a fraction of the deadly stream heading their way. For every tracer they could see, 4 or 5 additional rounds flew invisible through the air, and any one of them could prove fatal. There came a moment in the Pacific War when the balance of aerial combat shifted decisively and permanently against the Japanese. It was not a single battle, but rather a series of engagements throughout 1943 and 1944, where the combination of improved American tactics, better trained pilots, and devastating firepower overwhelmed Japanese air forces. Over the Solomon Islands, around Rabaul, in the skies above the Marianas, Japanese pilots who had once mocked American armor found themselves dying in numbers that shocked the Imperial Japanese military command. The mockery that had been so prevalent in Japanese ready rooms and pilot briefings died along with thousands of aviators, whose skill and courage could not overcome the fundamental design flaws in their aircraft. Japanese pilots would execute perfect intercepts, positioning themselves for ideal attacks on American bomber formations, only to be torn apart by the massed 50 caliber defensive fire from bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator. A single bomber might mount 10 or more 50 caliber guns, and American bomber formations flew in tight defensive boxes that created overlapping fields of fire. Japanese fighters attempting to press home attacks would fly into walls of 50 caliber bullets that shredded their lightweight aircraft. Even when Japanese pilots successfully engaged American fighters, the new American tactics made victories increasingly rare. Zeros would attempt to turn with Wildcats or Hellcats, only to discover that American pilots had learned discipline and patience. The Americans would refuse to engage in turning fights, instead extending away and climbing back to altitude for another boom and zoom pass. Japanese pilots found themselves in the frustrating position of flying technically superior aircraft in terms of maneuverability, but being unable to bring that advantage to bear. The tragedy of Japanese aviation in World War II extends beyond tactical and technical considerations into the realm of culture and philosophy. The Imperial Japanese military system was built on concepts of honor, sacrifice, and absolute devotion to the emperor and the nation. These values produced incredibly brave and dedicated warriors, but they also created a system that struggled to adapt when its fundamental assumptions proved flawed. Japanese military culture discouraged questioning orders or established doctrine. The idea that a pilot might need armor protection, or that an aircraft should prioritize survivability over performance ran counter to the warrior ethos that dominated Japanese military thinking. Even as evidence mounted that the Zero's lack of protection was costing Japan its most experienced pilots, the system struggled to respond effectively. Japanese aircraft designers did attempt to create improved fighters with better protection and more powerful engines, but these efforts came too late and in insufficient numbers to change the course of the war. Aircraft like the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden and the Nakajima Ki-84 Hate incorporated lessons learned from years of combat, but by the time they reached operational units in significant numbers, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The loss of experienced pilots compounded the problem exponentially. Unlike the Americans, who rotated combat pilots home after a set number of missions to serve as instructors for new pilots, Japan kept its experienced aviators in combat until they died. This meant that, as veterans fell in increasing numbers to 50 caliber fire, there were fewer and fewer skilled instructors to train replacements. The quality of Japanese pilot training declined dramatically as the war progressed, creating a vicious cycle where inexperienced pilots fell even more quickly to American guns, further depleting the pool of experienced aviators. The ultimate demonstration of American air superiority and the complete failure of Japanese fighter tactics came in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an engagement that American pilots would forever after call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation launched massive strikes against American carrier forces, sending wave after wave of aircraft in desperate attempts to sink American carriers and regain control of the Pacific. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. American pilots flying Hellcats equipped with the latest radar technology and combat tactics intercepted Japanese formations far from the carriers. The Japanese pilots, many of them poorly trained replacements who had received only minimal flight instruction, flew into a buzzsaw of 50 caliber fire. American pilots shot down Japanese aircraft in numbers that seemed almost impossible to believe. Individual American pilots would claim 6, 7, or even more victories in a single day. The final tally shocked both sides. The Japanese lost approximately 300 aircraft and many of their remaining experienced pilots in exchange for minimal damage to the American fleet. American losses were approximately 30 aircraft, most of those to accidents rather than combat. The kill ratio, which had once favored Japan in the early months of the war, had reversed to an almost comical degree. American pilots joked that shooting down Japanese aircraft had become as easy as hunting turkeys, hence the battle's nickname. But for the Japanese aviators who flew into that maelstrom of fire, there was nothing funny about the experience. They flew knowing they were likely to die, launched on missions by commanders who understood the desperate nature of Japan's strategic situation, but saw no alternative to continued attacks. Behind the statistics and tactical analyses were individual human beings whose lives were forever changed or ended in the cockpits of fighters high above the Pacific. Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai, one of the few Japanese aces to survive the entire war, wrote extensively about his experiences and the evolution of aerial combat. Sakai described the confidence of the early war years when Zero pilots felt invincible, and the growing desperation as American tactics and technology began to dominate the skies. He wrote of watching friends and fellow pilots die in flames, of seeing Zeros explode under .50 caliber fire, and of the increasing hopelessness that gripped Japanese aviation as the war turned against them. On the American side, pilots like David McCampbell, who became the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, demonstrated the effectiveness of proper tactics combined with the devastating power of .50 caliber armament. McCampbell described combat as a matter of patience and discipline, waiting for the perfect shot, and then delivering overwhelming firepower in a concentrated burst. He emphasized that American success came not from superior individual flying skill but from better tactics, better training systems, and aircraft designed with pilot survival as a priority. Other American pilots told stories of watching their .50 caliber rounds strike Japanese aircraft and seeing the immediate catastrophic results. Wings would fold upward from the impact of heavy bullets striking wing spars. Engines would explode in clouds of smoke and flame as .50 caliber rounds penetrated engine blocks and ignited fuel and oil. Japanese pilots would bail out of disintegrating aircraft, their parachutes blossoming as their fighters tumbled toward the ocean below. Japanese aviation engineers understood the problems with their fighter designs far earlier than the military establishment was willing to acknowledge. Technical reports and pilot debriefings made clear that the lack of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks was causing unsustainable losses. Engineers proposed numerous improvements and new designs that would address these deficiencies while maintaining competitive performance. But implementing these changes faced enormous obstacles. Japan's industrial capacity was far smaller than America's, and the nation struggled to produce sufficient quantities of even existing designs, let alone retool factories for new models. Strategic materials like high-quality steel and aluminum were in increasingly short supply as American submarines strangled Japanese shipping lanes. Perhaps most critically, Japanese military doctrine was slow to change, and commanders resisted admitting that fundamental assumptions about fighter design had been wrong from the beginning. Some improved Japanese fighters did reach operational service. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden featured better armor protection and more powerful armament than the Zero, and in the hands of experienced pilots it could hold its own against American fighters. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hellcat was by most measures an excellent fighter that combined good speed, maneuverability, and protection. But these aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. By the time they reached combat units, Japan had already lost air superiority permanently, and the experienced pilots who might have used these improved fighters effectively were mostly dead. American industrial and technological progress, meanwhile, accelerated throughout the war. Each new American fighter model brought improvements in speed, firepower, and protection. The P-51 Mustang, F-4U Corsair, and later models of the F6F Hellcat represented quantum leaps beyond the aircraft that had struggled against Zeros in early 1942. As Japan's strategic situation became increasingly hopeless, and the pool of trained pilots dwindled to almost nothing, Japanese commanders embraced a tactic that represented the ultimate expression of their warrior philosophy, and the ultimate admission that conventional aerial combat was no longer possible. The kamikaze attacks, where pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships, shocked the world with their apparent fanaticism. But viewed through the lens of Japan's desperate circumstances, kamikaze tactics made a certain terrible logic. A pilot with minimal training who had almost no chance of surviving a conventional combat mission might at least damage an enemy ship if he simply aimed his aircraft at it and held his course until impact. The kamikaze campaign represented the final failure of the Japanese fighter philosophy that had dominated the early war. Instead of agile fighters engaging in skilled dogfights, Japanese aviation had been reduced to using aircraft as manned cruise missiles, accepting the certain death of pilots as the price for even a chance at damaging the enemy. Even in this desperate role, the lack of armor in Japanese aircraft proved fatal. American ships put up intense anti-aircraft fire, and kamikaze pilots had to fly through storms of shells and bullets to reach their targets. The .50 caliber machine guns that had torn apart Japanese fighters in aerial combat now served as anti-aircraft weapons, firing from ship decks at approaching kamikaze aircraft. Many kamikaze planes were shot to pieces before reaching their targets, exploding in mid-air or crashing into the sea when .50 caliber fire ignited their fuel or killed their pilots. The Americans had learned to concentrate their fire, with multiple ships directing their weapons at individual incoming aircraft, creating walls of lead that few aircraft could penetrate. Those kamikaze that did break through often carried so much damage from defensive fire that their final impacts had less destructive effect than hoped. The cold statistics of aerial combat in the Pacific, numbers that showed Japanese losses mounting into the tens of thousands of aircraft and pilots, cannot fully convey the human tragedy that unfolded in the skies over the Pacific Ocean. Every number represented a young man who had trained for months or years, who had family and friends and dreams of the future, who climbed into a cockpit one final time and never returned. Japanese pilots in the later stages of the war flew knowing that their chances of survival were almost zero. They attended briefings where commanders acknowledged the desperate nature of their situation, but appealed to their sense of duty and honor. They wrote final letters to their families before missions, letters that often spoke of their willingness to die for the emperor and the homeland, but sometimes revealed their fear and sadness at leaving the world so young. American pilots, despite fighting for the winning side, also paid a terrible price. Thousands of American aviators died in the Pacific theater, shot down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, lost to accidents and mechanical failures, or killed when damaged aircraft crashed during landing attempts. The stress of combat took a psychological toll that left many survivors dealing with what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. American pilots might have had better equipment and tactics, but they still faced fear and death every time they climbed into their cockpits. The .50 caliber machine guns that proved so devastating against Japanese aircraft could not protect American pilots from everything. A lucky shot from a Japanese pilot, an engine failure at the wrong moment, or a moment's inattention could still prove fatal even in the heavily armored American fighters. The story of Japanese pilots mocking American armor only to die under .50 caliber fire contains lessons that extend far beyond the specific context of World War II aerial combat. It illustrates the danger of allowing doctrine and philosophy to override practical reality, of letting pride and tradition prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. The Japanese military's emphasis on offensive spirit and fighting spirit, while it produced incredibly brave and dedicated warriors, also created a system that struggled to acknowledge mistakes or change course when evidence showed that fundamental assumptions were wrong. The story also demonstrates the importance of protecting your most valuable assets. Aircraft can be replaced relatively quickly by an industrial power, but experienced pilots represent years of training and accumulated knowledge. The American policy of rotating combat pilots home to train new generations of aviators, while it might have seemed wasteful in the short term, paid enormous dividends as the war progressed. Japanese policy of keeping pilots in combat until they died meant that Japan's pool of experienced aviators steadily diminished even during periods when Japanese industry could still replace lost aircraft. Technologically, the Pacific Air War showed that there is no single correct answer to fighter design. The Zero's emphasis on maneuverability and range made it extraordinarily effective in the early war period when Japanese pilot quality was high and American tactics were still evolving. But that same design philosophy created vulnerabilities that became fatal once American pilots learned how to exploit them. A balanced approach that considers protection and firepower, alongside maneuverability and performance, might not produce the absolute best fighter in any single category, but it creates a more survivable and adaptable weapons system. By the summer of 1945, Japanese aviation had been reduced to a shadow of its former might. Most of Japan's experienced pilots were dead, shot down by .50 caliber fire or lost in kamikaze attacks. The aircraft factories that had produced Zeros and other fighters in the thousands had been destroyed by American bombing or sat idle for lack of materials and workers. American aircraft roamed freely over Japanese skies, their pilots encountering little opposition as they struck targets across the home islands. The few remaining Japanese fighters that rose to challenge American raids were often flown by pilots with barely enough training to take off and land. These young men, some with less than 100 hours of total flight time, attempted to engage American pilots who had survived years of combat and perfected their skills through dozens or hundreds of missions. The results were predictable and tragic. Japanese aircraft would attempt intercepts and be shot down within minutes by American pilots whose .50 caliber guns had become extensions of their will. The mockery that Japanese pilots had directed at American armor in the early war years had been answered definitively. American pilots flew home mission after mission in aircraft riddled with bullet holes, protected by the armor plating that Japanese pilots had scorned. Japanese pilots died by the thousands in aircraft that offered no protection, no second chances, no margin for error. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the skies over Japan fell silent. The few remaining Japanese aircraft were gathered and destroyed as part of the surrender terms. The pilots who had survived, men like Saburo Sakai who had flown through the entire war and witnessed the rise and fall of Japanese naval aviation, faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives in a defeated nation. The story of Japanese pilots and American .50 caliber machine guns became part of the larger narrative of World War II, studied by military historians and aviation enthusiasts for generations. The technical lessons influenced fighter design for decades, with most nations adopting philosophies that balance performance with protection. The human lessons about the cost of pride and the importance of adapting to reality found applications far beyond aviation. For the men who fought in the Pacific skies, both American and Japanese, the memories remained vivid for the rest of their lives. American pilots who had survived the desperate early days when Zeros dominated the Pacific remembered the terror of those first encounters and the satisfaction of learning to fight back effectively. Japanese pilots who survived the war remembered the confidence of the early victories and the desperation of the later defeats. Many formed friendships across the former battle lines, meeting at reunions and commemorations to remember the days when they tried to kill each other in the skies above the Pacific. The aircraft themselves became museum pieces and treasured artifacts. Surviving Zeros, carefully restored by aviation enthusiasts, remind modern audiences of the grace and danger of these legendary fighters. American aircraft from the Pacific War, Hellcats and Corsairs and Mustangs, demonstrate the industrial and technological might that ultimately won the air war. When these vintage aircraft perform at air shows, the sound of their engines and the bark of their guns evoke memories of a time when the sky was a battlefield and young men died by the thousands. Looking back across the decades, perhaps the most important lesson from this story is the danger of allowing philosophical commitment to override practical necessity. The Japanese emphasis on spiritual strength and warrior spirit, while it created an incredibly motivated and brave fighting force, also blinded Japanese military leaders to fundamental problems with their equipment and tactics. The mockery directed at American armor reflected a deeper unwillingness to acknowledge that protection and survival mattered as much as offensive capability. American military philosophy, more pragmatic and materialistic, prioritized bringing pilots home alive so they could fly again tomorrow. This approach might have seemed less heroic than the Japanese emphasis on glorious sacrifice, but it proved far more effective in the grinding attritional warfare that modern industrial conflicts inevitably become. The .50 caliber machine gun became the symbol of American pragmatism, a weapon chosen not for elegance or tradition, but simply because it worked devastatingly well at the task of destroying enemy aircraft. The human cost of Japan's philosophical commitment was staggering. Thousands of young men who might have survived with better protection died in fragile aircraft that prioritized performance over survivability. Their bravery and skill could not overcome fundamental design flaws that their own military leadership was slow to acknowledge and address. By the time Japan attempted to field fighters with better protection and more powerful armament, the war had already been decided. The skies over the Pacific had become an American domain, patrolled by fighters whose pilots had learned hard lessons and whose .50 caliber guns spoke the final word in any engagement. Today, more than 8 decades after the Pacific War ended, the story of Japanese pilots and American .50 caliber machine guns continues to resonate. It appears in countless books and documentaries, in museum exhibits and academic studies. The technical details fascinate aviation enthusiasts who debate the relative merits of different aircraft designs and tactical approaches. The human drama moves audiences who cannot imagine the courage required to climb into a cockpit knowing you might not return. Veterans of the Pacific Air War, now almost all gone, left behind memoirs and oral histories that preserve their experiences for future generations. These accounts from both American and Japanese perspectives reveal the complexity of warfare beyond simple narratives of good and evil. Japanese pilots who mocked American armor were not villains, but young men shaped by their culture and their training, confident in their equipment and their cause. American pilots who unleashed devastating .50 caliber fire were not heroes without complexity, but young men trying to survive and complete their missions in the most effective way possible. The aircraft that fought in the Pacific skies, especially the iconic Zero and the rugged American fighters that ultimately defeated it, continue to capture imaginations. The sight of a restored Zero performing at an air show, its engine singing as it climbs and turns through the sky, evokes both admiration for its elegant design and sadness for the thousands of pilots who died at its controls. The sound of a Hellcat's 650 caliber guns, even firing blanks for a demonstration, reminds audiences of the awesome destructive power these weapons brought to Pacific skies. The lessons learned in blood and fire over the Pacific Ocean shaped military aviation for generations and continue to influence fighter design and tactical thinking today. The complete story of Japanese pilots mocking American armor until .50 caliber bullets tore their planes apart is ultimately a tragedy of miscalculation, pride, and the terrible learning process that is modern warfare. It began with Japanese confidence built on early success and a military philosophy that valued offense and maneuverability above all else. It progressed through a bitter period of American adaptation, as pilots and planners learned to exploit Japanese weaknesses while playing to their own strengths. It culminated in the comprehensive defeat of Japanese aviation, as 50 caliber machine guns and improved tactics turned the Pacific skies into a shooting gallery, where Japanese pilots died by the thousands in aircraft that offered them no protection. The mockery that Japanese pilots had directed at American armor in the early war years proved tragically misplaced. The heavy steel plates that surrounded American pilots' cockpits brought those pilots home alive, mission after mission, building experience and skill that made them ever more deadly. The 50 caliber machine guns that Japanese pilots dismissed as unnecessary weight became instruments of devastation that tore apart the lightweight Zeros as easily as shredding paper. In the end, the philosophy that produced the Zero, the emphasis on purity of purpose and acceptance of sacrifice, could not overcome the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare. American industrial capacity, tactical flexibility, and emphasis on pilot survival created a system that grew stronger as the war progressed while Japanese aviation grew steadily weaker. The final chapters of the Pacific Air War saw American pilots flying over Japan itself with near impunity, their 50 caliber guns ready, but often unnecessary as Japanese aviation had been reduced to almost nothing. The skies that had once belonged to the Zero, where Japanese pilots had ruled as masters and mocked their enemies, had become American territory, controlled by fighters whose armor turned away bullets and whose guns answered every challenge with overwhelming firepower. This is how empires fall and how assumptions die, not in a single dramatic moment, but through thousands of small defeats that accumulate into catastrophic loss. This is how mockery turns to ashes, and how the thunder of 50 caliber guns writes history in the empty sky where proud pilots once flew toward glory and found only death.